Y'all hear me okay?
Sure.
It is 1 o'clock. Wow, we have some true back row folks here. You're welcome. I know you're welcome to move up, but I know the comfort level.
Can we
Too
stand
close.
tall and be more comfortable?
There you go.
Carolyn, Kirby.
Let's see here. Let me get off this. Okay. Thanks for braving a Friday afternoon and coming out to go over a few financial numbers. And it's informal. I'm going to go through similar pages I've gone through in the past just to update the numbers for you. And at any time, if you've got questions, just raise your hand, interrupt me, and I'll try to answer the question as best I can. So, a couple things before we get started, just to kind of let you know where we're at, just from the life of the finance department. We've just completed our budget season, and actually yesterday our board of directors met and put the final approval on the budget, not only for Trinity Landing, but for all the other Lutheran Services affiliates. So that happened yesterday. That has finished a process that started back probably in the April-May standpoint when we go through our budget process. We start with capital budgets, those things that have tangible value, that things like buses or renovations or significant capital improvements. Bonnie and the other administrators and executive directors put in the inputs, and that's something that through the resident council and all you have is an area that you might have inputs over the years of things that you might think are priorities that can go directly to Bonnie for consideration for the future. But that starts off the process, and then they get into the detailed budgeting. So Bonnie and her team put together the manpower, the employee count, the team member count, look at all the different expenditures that are running at this current fiscal year and try to project into next fiscal year. Our fiscal year begins on 10/1 and ends on 9/30. And so they have several months that they go through and do that, and then all those inputs are fed into the operations heads and myself, and we review them, put them all, from my standpoint, I put them all together, try to make sure they make sense on a macro level, not just on a micro level, and then we start the presentations to our board. For Trinity Landing and other senior services affiliates, we go through 3 different rounds of review. We go through first, every single corporation's board reviews the budget, and that's kind of an all-day affair because we probably have close to 40 different budgets we review. And so we go through all those in the good part of one day, probably 5 or 6 hours it takes us when all is said and done. And then probably 2, 3, 4 weeks later, we go bring it up one level and have kind of a subset of just the big Lutheran Services Board to review in not as much detail, but in some detail. And then yesterday, we reviewed it with the whole board and just did a high-level review. It took probably about 45 minutes or so to go through just some of the high-level schedules as to where we're at. And so, as of yesterday afternoon, things are official on the budget cycle. So that closes, but for Lutheran Services Carolinas and Trinity Landing specifically, we start the audit process. And it actually started probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. We have our auditors, even though our fiscal year has not ended yet, we have our auditors come in usually in August for about a week or so to start doing some preliminary work on this year's audit that's ending 9/30 for our fiscal year, 9/30/2025. So they'll start to review things like processes, have any processes changed, and put together all the basics in August. They'll do some testing. You figure they have 6 or 7 months of transactions that they can test. It's not 12 months, but they can do some testing and review of other aspects just to get hopefully some of the simple things out of the way. They'll be back into our offices in Salisbury the second week in November and be there for a couple weeks before they leave. And then they usually leave with a list of items saying, we need these other 10, 12, 15 items, and we'll work back and forth till Christmas time and try to get a good draft out. The key date for our audit is to get it submitted by January 28th, and that's required by our bondholder documents that are out there that says we have to have a completed audit that is published and readily available for review. So that's the process we're just going to start off with now going into the fall. And it sounds really simple, especially as I'm up here talking about it. It sounds simple, but it always gets into be a little stickier than it seems like it should. It seems like one area the auditors will focus on 1 year and we'll get through all the details of what they're asking for and get through that piece, and then we might make sure the following year that is really sewed up tight before we even get to the auditors, and then they'll, as they should, pick a different area to look at and give a lot of scrutiny to. So it's just a year after year thing, and our team gets used to it, but we've got a lot of good people behind the scenes that are putting all those transactions together and keeping track of things. So I think we're in pretty good shape to start the process for this fiscal 2025 audit. I have chosen not to put it on full screen mode because full screen mode is a lot neater, but it makes it smaller. So I'm going to try to go through this as it is and keep it a little bit bigger so that hopefully you can see it. Hopefully you had a chance to look at it. If not, it is online. That's what I've been told. So it's online under a financial folder section on the online portal. So if you can't see it, you can always go back and take another look at it after the fact. I always like to start off with this slide. This is our occupancy for Trinity Landing. You can see, let me see my fancy little laser. There we go. You can see this is through July, so it's 10 months out of the fiscal year. You can see July's average occupancy. That number right there is the blend of 98.6. It's a little bit higher than our year-to-date of 97.6, so we're right in the 98 percentile for the year. And we budgeted, I shouldn't say we budgeted, I budgeted 95%. So I might have told this story already, but Bonnie came in last year and her original submission for the year we're in now that we're just finishing up is 98% for occupancy, which just as a mathematical thing, we multiply that out by the monthly fees and you get stronger numbers than if you're at 95%. And I kind of hemmed and hawed and said, that would be great, but 98% is very unrealistic. If a community like Trinity Landing is low to mid-90s, it's doing great. 98%, way high, and regardless of how great Ann and Candy and everybody else is in the office there that does some marketing stuff, there's just transition. Somebody moves out, it might take 30 days for somebody to move back in, and I don't count that. Even though that apartment might be sold, so to speak, and there's a resident coming in, I don't count that in my stats because I haven't got payment yet, because I'm looking at the dollars. So I just said, I would feel more comfortable if you put it down to 95% and budget 95%. And here we are 10 months later at 98%. So go figure, that shows you how much I know versus the folks here on the ground. So that's extraordinary by any measure. Whether you go into Charlotte or Wilmington proper or wherever you go at the competitors, staying and being at 95% is awesome. Being at 98%, again, is really unheard of, and to be at it for an extended period of time is fantastic. So kudos to everybody here. Go out and tell your friends, get on the list, and then when somebody else moves out, your friends can move in. So great year from occupancy level. The reason why I show this first is simply because if you look at a community like Trinity Landing and occupancies in the low to mid 90s, you can infer that the dollars that we're going to look at should work out, unless there's something extraordinary in the background, but it should be able to be a healthy financial, have a healthy financial aspect to the community. So that's why I like to show this first. Let me skip down to the next page and see how much I can get on the page. We'll focus on the top. This is the balance sheet. This has some highlights on that hopefully yours does, and I put them on, I believe, after I sent it to Bonnie for publishing, but I just wanted to highlight a couple numbers on there just to draw them to your attention and to make sure I didn't forget to talk about them. So the balance sheet, you notice that top line, cash and cash equivalents, pretty self-explanatory. You can see it went down from about 7 million to 3 million. It's an oversimplification to say, well, we put all our money, extra money in investments, but in general, we did put a lot in investments this past year, just over $7 million, which is great. We have an investment advisor that uses Vanguard mutual funds, and so we've got an investment pool in there, and that's where they reside in mutual funds, much like some of you probably have. So that's a good news story. The other thing I would say, the other column went up just a little bit, well, a couple $1 million, that's more than a little bit. A lot of that represents funds that can go to other affiliates if other affiliates need help during the year. If we were to look at this during the construction phase, it was probably flipped in the sense that early on, Trinity Landing, we had loans, but some of the operating capital probably came here. And so it's a back and forth thing. If Trinity Landing needed that money to pay out refunds or whatever, we would flip it back as we keep track of all the individual transactions between the different affiliates. But a lot of that is what that represents. Some other things that are in there, sales tax. The other thing that's a good news story I mentioned is the employee retention credit, ERC, I think that's right. Anybody heard of the ERC? It's from COVID days, which seemed like a long time ago. COVID days back in the early 2022, 23 probably. I guess it was at the tail end. Another governmental program that employers like Trinity Landing and other affiliates under Lutheran Services could apply for a credit to essentially what came down to the FICA taxes that are paid for employees each and every quarter. For us, each and every payroll, that we file the actual return each quarter. And so it was meant to give organizations like us relief in those taxes. We filed that back in, again, 2022-ish, 2023, and it originally, a lot of other organizations were filing as well, and I think the government thought, hey, wait a minute, this seems to be a free-for-all. We're not sure everybody's really entitled to this. We're pressing the pause key, and we're not going to process any more of these returns until we get a handle on what's happening. So our amount, which is, I meant to look it up before I came, but it's several $100,000 for Trinity Landing, just sat there in the IRS offices because the government decided not to process anything at that point. So fast forward till now, we finally got a check in for not only Trinity Landing, but several other affiliates all at the same time, but it's been probably 3 years that it's just been waiting. But that's the good news. thing for both Trinity Landing and the rest of the affiliates that they finally processed those returns. So that number, that portion of that 9.3 will come off. We just received that in August. These are as of July, so it doesn't show. But that's a good news story for all of LSC that's transacted this past month. Prepaid expenses, it didn't change a lot, but it's a big number. Predominantly, that is insurance on Trinity Landing that we spread over the year period. Actually, the cost for insurance for properties like Trinity Landing, which are unique, did come down this year. Trinity Landing, Lutheran Services Carolinas is a part of a larger insurance consortium of other type communities like Trinity Landing throughout the state of North Carolina and South Carolina. And we have common practices. We're kind of slated as, at least we think of ourselves as the cream of the crop. We try to do risk management practices at all our communities to make sure we're not doing anything we shouldn't do. So a lot of continuing education and best practices go on. Interestingly enough, as you might expect, Trinity Landing, at least for property coverage, is carved out of that group because it sits right on the water. It's the reason why some of you came to be in a beautiful spot like that, and it's the reason why our insurance is higher as well, because we're in a spot like that. So the coverage over the past couple of years has come down, the price of coverage has come down. If I were to show you a graph, and I didn't even think to bring it, but there is a pictorial that our insurance broker has given us that shows the amounts just nationwide, nothing to do specifically with Trinity Landing or retirement communities in general, but just where have the natural disasters that have caused these huge insurance losses, where have they occurred? Naturally, I think right here along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and that's where a lot are because that's what we hear about, that's where we live. But interestingly enough, over the past several years, a lot of the losses have come in the Midwest. Tornadoes, flooding, you've heard on the news, all those types of things. So the industry years ago has started to hike up the prices for coastal locations like Trinity Landing simply because of hurricane season. But when they look back at the actuals, they realized a lot of the calamities were happening, not necessarily on the coast, not that we don't have our fair share, but a lot was happening inland in the Midwest. And so those prices for those communities and other property owners have started to go up. And here on the coast, we've gotten some relief. This year, we chose not to necessarily get cheaper coverage or more inexpensive coverage, but we decided to keep our premium essentially level, but by stronger coverage, by a stronger coverage form for the community. So still win-win overall, but it's still expensive. We park it in this account, and we pull out a little bit out each month, or in this case, since it's a large number, we pull a fair amount out each month to expense it, and then when we renew, we start all over again next renewal season. The operating reserve, I'll just point that out just as a matter of practice. That line item there is the amount we're required to set aside based on the Department of Insurance guidelines. It roughly estimates a portion of our expenses, our operating expenses, and then any principal payments we have to make. So since Trinity Landing is so strong on the occupancy numbers, we only have to set aside 25%. Other organizations, if they fall below 90%, have to set aside 50% or double that number. So we're in a good situation there. It's essentially a rainy day reserve, so if Trinity Landing did have issues in the future and the Department of Insurance had to come in and do some type of oversight, they at least know that some funds have been set aside essentially for them to use to get a community like Trinity Landing out of trouble. Don't foresee that happening here. Wish I didn't have to set it aside on this balance sheet, but nonetheless, we do have to follow those regulations. If I scroll down to the bottom part, so that's the assets up top, the liabilities, and they all come out to be that number up top there, 134.4, and this is the other half, the liabilities, and the net asset number needs to add up to the same thing in order to balance. So we've got current liabilities. Those are things that can fluctuate a fair amount month to month depending on timing of things. Like for instance, there's accrued salary and payable in the middle there. That decreased by a fair amount from this other period here, which was 9/30/2024. But that could be way up or way down depending on when the payroll cycle hits during the month. And that's expected to fluctuate quite a bit. These other larger numbers we've talked about before, I'll just give a brief overview because that out of the entire number, that makes up the biggest part, those three line items. So long-term debt, self-explanatory, what's left over after building Trinity Landing is about $76 million. It was higher when we were under construction, but we used some of the entry fees that were paid. They're called first generations, the first residents, some of which are you that came in. We used the entry fees to actually pay off some of our debt to make it a more manageable level. And that's pretty standard for a community like Trinity Landing. So what remains is $75 million, almost 76, and we pay interest on that, and over time we'll pay principal and pay that off. Refundable fees and deferred revenue. So when you come into Trinity Landing, your refund option dictates where we put your entry fee in the accounting system. If you chose the limited refund program, which means after about 4 years, your entry fee is earned by the community and there's no refund due after that, then we're going to put the entire amount in this deferred revenue line item, $41.5 million at this point. If you chose a different option, the 50% or the 90%, we split that up. So again, use simple math. It's $100,000 for an entry fee. If you chose a 90% refund option, I put in $90,000 in that number there, the refundable fees, because at some point it's going to come back to you. And I put only $10,000 in this number here. Conversely, if it's 50-50, it's pretty straightforward. $50,000 would go up in this line item here, refundable fees, and $50,000 down here in the deferred revenue. So what happens on a monthly basis, we really don't touch this. We adjust it based on new residents who come in and put it in the proper bucket. But other than that, this deferred revenue is just as it says, it's deferred till the future. So we take all these pieces, and I've got a software system that breaks it out resident by resident, and it uses statistical data to estimate life expectancy. So again, if you figure 10-year life expectancy and the amount of your entry fee that ended up in that deferred revenue line item was $100,000, we take out $10,000 each year and recognize it as earned revenue. And so that number of deferred revenue would slowly go down as we pull that in and say we've earned that money. The other part to it, and I'll get to it in a second, is what happens if you decide to move out before that 10 years happens. And it's called accelerated amortization. So the other piece, we're trying to spread equally over 10 years. If you move out halfway through, we've got a lump sum that we need to deal with somehow. So in that case, we will bring it into revenue right at that 1 month. And so it's an anomaly. It's a large sum. It could be a large sum, but we bring it into revenue all at once. And I'll show you where that is in just a moment on that income statement. The last thing I would just mention on this page here is the net assets. So you can see here, huge negative number. This is 9/30/2024. And this is where we're at 7/31/2025. A significant change to the good. which was expected. So this, in my mind, represents the accumulation of how Trinity Landing has operated over the years. It's just an accumulation of that. So if you think early on, when we open the doors, we've got all these fixed costs, we've got people here waiting to serve you, and we don't have 208 apartments and villas filled, we've got maybe 10 in the first week. And then at the end of the first month, 20. And it gradually increased, and we filled up Trinity Landing vastly faster than was expected, which is another good story. But early on, we've got a lot of expenses, but not a lot of revenue to cover those expenses. And so early on, when we look at the income statement, that number at the bottom, the operating income, was a big negative number. It was an operating loss, again expected, but nonetheless a loss. And so the idea is over time that as we operate and operate well from a financial standpoint, that number will come down and eventually flip from being a negative number to a positive number, and will keep growing over time. It's just one sign of the financial health. It's not the only sign, but it is one sign of financial health. So that's moving in the right direction, and that's a good news story. Any questions?
So on the long-term debt, so is there some balloon payment coming due, or when will that be completely satisfied?
So the question is about long-term debt. When will that be satisfied? Actually, it's a complicated answer, but it is a 30-year term. So it's going to take, especially for Trinity Landing's piece of that, it's pretty much going to take the full 30 years for it to get paid off. Kind of like your house mortgage. Takes 30 years. If you kept it the whole time, it'll take that long. The structure, I won't go into too detail, but the structure behind the scenes is this is combined with a lot of other debt that Lutheran Services had. And so if you looked at the amortization schedule, it's not as simple as taking everybody's mortgage that goes over the next 30 years and just combining it all. There's a lot of regs out there that says, hey, if you refinance some debt that only had 10 years left on it, you can't refinance it and extend it out to the full 30 years, kind of like we usually do in our personal mortgages. If we refinance, most of the time it's reset to 30 years. The regs don't let us do that. They say you've got to keep that original, so you can refinance and get a lower interest rate, which is great, but that 10-year period that you have left on that one particular loan still has to be 10. And so we had several different loans with all different maturity dates, so it just ended up that this was the newest project, so it's pushed out to be 30 years in total.
But probably started 5 years ago when we first started construction, right? So does that mean it's 25 years left?
Correct. The question is, we did start several years ago, so yes, we're into that. It's not 30 years from today. We're in that several years. But that number there, that 75,876, that will not come down significantly until probably 20 years from now. Just again, because of the amortization schedule in aggregate that we had to follow based on the regulations.
Thank you.
That's probably more than you ever wanted to know, and it's a head scratcher. But if you really want to look at some details afterwards, I'd be happy to show you. Let me get on to the last two schedules. This is what you people usually are looking at, is the income statement. See if I can get most of that on. We know it's Trinity Landing and income statement, so I'm going to cut that off. Okay, let me get down a little bit further. Get that last number. Okay, it takes the whole screen. We know we're Trinity Landing. We know it's through July. So here are the numbers. So let me just jump to the bottom. Right now, we're ahead of where we thought we'd be. We're at 2.56 million versus 1.3. So that's a good news story from the standpoint financially we're performing stronger than we expected. If you look at expenses, there are some wide variances here, and on the next page, when you cut it down functionally, you'll see some wide variances all over. I particularly am a bottom line type of guy, and so I already told you when we started these budgets, we started this a year and a half ago for this budget we're looking at now, because I told you we just completed the fiscal year 2026 budget, and that was started back in April, and we're starting that fiscal year in October, and so there is a significant lag time between the time we start the budget process, just from a practical standpoint, from the time we're in operation. So it's a great roadmap, and that's why we do it, to say if we stick with these factors, if we're this full, if we do these certain things, we should have these outcomes. But as you might expect, it never quite happens that way. So there's going to be some areas that we're over, some areas that we're under. It may be staffing, and maybe we had to do this extra project. But I'm always looking for folks like Bonnie and the other executive directors to try to manage to that bottom line. And so to be within $32,000 or so out of $13 million is fantastic. It'd be great if these were exactly on and all this column of variances were zeros, but that's not realistic. But managing to that number to keep this variance number in aggregate as small as possible is great. If I go back up to the revenue, so I've got these two top line items that make up the bulk of really why we're seeing this number here. One, net resident service revenue. That's a really generic bad title, but that's basically your monthly fees coming in. And because I told Bonnie, I already told the story, I told Bonnie to budget at 95%, and she operated at 98%. We're over here. So that's, again, positive. This amortization of deferred entrance fees, I usually, during budget time, run my report from the software I have that's statistically based and get that number to plug in here. It's fairly straightforward and usually pretty close, although we've got residents moving in and out. The thing that's hard to predict is that second scenario for the amortization of income, of entry fees, where a resident was supposed to be here for 10 years and decides to move out for 5 years. What do I do with that extra, in that scenario, $50,000? What do I do with that? I bring it into income. That's hard to measure. I can't predict if somebody's going to stay or leave. So from that standpoint, we try to estimate using historical data, but the historical data is all over the board. It could be really high one year, really low one year. We budget the best we can. In this case, the majority of that 949 favorable variance is due to folks that have left the community, and we've taken the rest of the entry fee that they paid in and put it into revenue. So if you follow the numbers down, hopefully between the revenues and expenses, you'll remember this number from the prior page, the current net assets, that 199, that's reduced from, at the beginning of the year, the $5.9 million, almost $6 million negative. So that's how that number improves, is by the performance that we have each and every year. I'll just do a quick mention. This other change in net assets, that's a conglomeration of a lot of different things that are not really controllable by an executive director, things like investment income, interest income, those types of things. So we do that, put that below the line, and have Bonnie and her team focus on these numbers up here. And then this last slide just focuses on the same data, just in a different manner, looking at some of the variances functionally, department by department. Some of them you recognize, obviously, dietary, housekeeping services. They're pretty intuitive. You can see there are some fairly large variances. The one that sticks out the most, plant operations and maintenance. I know a lot of that deals with outside contract services and a lot of the fixes we've had to do that for one reason or another weren't covered by insurance. Or it could be other things that have happened during the year. So that's predominantly why that number is so big. That is probably somewhat hard to predict. But unfortunately, those are the types of things that I get from Bonnie and her boss, Keisha, who is the chief operating officer, saying, hey, can I capitalize this? Meaning, do I have to really count it in my expenses? Can I put it on the balance sheet? And usually I'm the bad guy and say, no, that really should be in this set of numbers. And so again, it's just a balancing act and managing within the parameters that we have, but overall, doing well. I think some of it is like dietary. I know it was, the biggest pieces there were, I think, both salary and raw food. Employee services, that's a generic term, but that's where all the taxes, employee health insurance, those types of things go, all bundled for all departments in that one line item. Again, intuitively, if some of your salaries are down, some of those aspects, the employee health insurance and all, are going to be down as well under budget. But all in all, again, to be within $32,000 of what was originally planned is a great job out of $13 million. And as we get down again to the bottom here, hopefully you see that same number. We started at the 5 million, I guess it was closer to 5 than 6. Have a $3 million increase between all the different pieces, and we're sitting at, as in July, just under the $2 million mark there. And hopefully, by the end of next year, we'll flip that to be a positive figure and start growing from there. So I'm going to pause at this point and see if there are any questions that I can answer about this, or maybe there's something I didn't cover that has been on your mind.
Okay, plant operations every time is way off. Have you considered that in the budget for next year?
Plant operations, if plant operations is way off, do we increase it for next year? And I'd say, I can't remember the specific numbers for next year. I think the general answer is yes. If there are some one-offs where it's deemed that it's just a one-time event, probably not. But if there are certain things that keep going over, yes, we should adjust it for future years. The other aspect I can remember and look at the details is electricity seemed to be higher than budget. And so that's just a learning experience. Obviously, it depends on if it's cold or hot during the year, but that's another element that's there. That's more of a one that's probably based on history that we should be able to adjust for future years. But fixes, like I know we had some trees fall on corners of villas and those types of things that needed to get fixed, and some other fixes like that. Hopefully those types of things are just single events, and therefore we probably wouldn't budget them year after year. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if I understand what I'm saying, but bear with me. We hear a lot that maintenance problems, for instance, the ductwork, is because it wasn't built sufficiently or correctly by the builder. We have to accept that. I think we have a lawsuit, but.
Yeah, and Bonnie may know more than I. I know, unfortunately, the building at Trinity Landing was a great project, but at the end it did kind of trail off with a long laundry list of punch list items to do. And I think at the end we kind of settled out on who's going to do what. But unfortunately, there are going to be some of those things that have lingered on, and I don't know if there's any follow-up after that in general.
No, in general we settled, and that is, so so you're 100% right with the plant operations, electricity and some of those fixes are the biggest variance. I have said to Kirby and in the board report with budgeting that I hope by, well, I said it last year and then I said it again this year, is I hope that is trending down. I mean, I guess the large scale answer to that is sometimes it's actually more expensive to pursue a legal avenue than to fix it if we think we're getting there.
And I've been involved in several projects like Tree Landing, and fortunately, despite best expectations and all, most of them have seemed to end up kind of that way where there's just a punch list that never quite gets satisfactorily done. Or there are some just wranglings at the end that make it, that sour the few years of the construction at the end.
What kinds of things fall in concession services?
Concession services, what kind of things fall in concession services? That is a good question. That's basically an other category. I think things, trying to think of things that would be in there.
For us, the primary numbers are alcohol purchases and paying our salon vendors. Those are the two major contributors. And they do balance out. If you were looking at a detail, then it balances out in income in some of the in bar sales, salon service sales, things like that. And also it is part of an expense for your flex account, you know, that $375 that you get every month. So that's one of the ways expenses go into that.
And there's usually, on the detail on the revenue side, there's usually a concessions income as well. We probably didn't, I was gonna go back to see, I don't think they showed it, it's probably buried in other income, but that income is in there as well to kind of offset what's there. And there, depending on the community, there are other pieces, those are the big pieces, I guess, here. There are other pieces in other communities that would fall in that concessions and services as well. But it's more an other category than actually, you think of concessions, you're at a ball game or something and you're selling things. It's not usually quite like that.
On the salaries, which on this version of the chart, they're spread out among all those departments.
Yes.
Do we budget, or do you budget for zero turnover? I mean, often what happens is you have a staffing plan, but you're not 100% staffed. And so you actually don't spend what you might have theoretically planned for. How is that budgeting done here? Do you assume some turnover, or do you assume full employment all the time?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear the question was about salary, staffing, turnover, and how we budget for that. I'll give you a generic answer and I'll let Bonnie chime in. In general, that's probably the largest variance if you look across the board at other Lutheran services communities, is that pretty much we're budgeting to be more or less full staff. This is what we would like to see at our nursing homes, at our retirement communities, and we're more towards that end than not. And in reality, it is true. During the year, somebody will leave, and it's just kind of as I talked about, even with the occupancy, even though you may have somebody coming in for a period of time, you're without that staff person or that position filled, and so you're not running maybe quite what you had budgeted. And in some cases, it takes a fairly long time to fill all the different positions. So lots of times that is a reason for the difference between what we budget and what actually happens. And I don't know if you've got any other comments you'd like to make on that.
I think probably just that if I compared between Trinity Grove and Trinity Landing, where Trinity Grove has about 3 times as many team members as Trinity Landing, you definitely notice a smaller variance here. But yes, you have gaps when you're trying to fill a position. We've maintained very close to 100% staffed though, and then also, we do budget in training expense, which is really what the expense is of adding new team members, so we do add some there in the budget as well to kind of try to fill that gap.
Another variable along that line, and if you look back up at this very top line, employee services, is personal time off. So our system is that each employee gets a bucket of hours as they earn them throughout the year to use for holiday, vacation, sick time. And so that also can affect these numbers, and I know is a part of that 105 there variance, is that if employees don't take a lot of their time, they build it up, it affects this, or if they take a lot of time and spend it, it can affect these numbers as well. The other piece of that, it just depends on whether that position has to be filled while somebody's out. So if I go on vacation, we're not hiring somebody for a week or 2 weeks to come in and fill my slot. So from a purely financial standpoint, it doesn't affect the numbers as much. If you were to look at where I'm budgeted in all Lutheran Services numbers, it doesn't affect it that much. But if all the dietary staff, all the servers decide they need to go on vacation all at the same time, we've got to have somebody else come in to keep up the dining area. So in that case, for those times, it could be double counting. One salary for the actual person working and one for the person who's actually out on personal time. Good questions? Any other questions? Uh-oh, that was unplanned. But if there aren't any other questions, I appreciate you coming for the afternoon and spending a few minutes of your Friday. It's nicer outside than it is inside, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon out. And I'll be around